This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Ontario Sewer and Water Main Construction Association. Clean water is everybody's business.
Hello, welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and we have our third and final round of the Surety series. And with me I have
Zulqernain Malik from Smartbuild Construction.
Andrew Cartwright, the Vice President of Surety from FCA Insurance Brokers.
And Jeff Scorgie, a construction lawyer at WeirFoulds.
And this is going to be a rapid fire round. So we've got a bunch of questions, and each person will kind of answer within their realm of expertise. So you'll see certain people taking the lead on certain stuff, and then certain people taking the lead on other stuff. So the first one I'll start with is the value and responsiveness of surety bonds. What would the comments be on concerns to how valuable these things are?
Yeah, Warren, it's a great question, and we hear a lot of that feedback in the industry, and really the surety industry itself has gone through a couple of tests in the last few years as different provinces have looked at their construction acts and prompt payment, and part of that has been looking at mandatory bonding. And so the first test case for that was really the province of Ontario, and the Surety Association of Canada actually commissioned a third-party independent report by the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis to look at the value of surety bonds. And they went through that, and they didn't know what the answer was going to be at the end of the day, but they did that analysis, and they looked at $150,000 bonded projects over the last 20 years, done by 10,000 construction firms and 3,000 different project insolvencies. And what they found was that non-bonded contractors were 10 times more likely to go insolvent than bonded contractors. They found that there was $3.5 million of additional GDP for every $1 million of premium, and that the bonds created 25 jobs or $1.5 million of additional wage protection for every $1 million of premium spent. So really, it showed that bonds really do have a value. The challenge, I think, and what we need to do better, and I know the Surety Association does a bunch of this, but as stakeholders in this, whether surety brokers or surety companies or Surety Association of Canada, we need to continue to educate users of bonds on how they work, right? They're not demand instruments, they're default instruments. And so people need to understand how to claim on them. We need to develop bond forms that continue to be more responsive and adapt to different project delivery methods so that these bonds are really useful and people understand what they're doing.
Okay, and do you guys have anything to add to that?
I guess from a contractor's perspective, it's a necessary evil. In the absence of having a surety program or a bonded program, you're not going to be able to compete on a large segment of project work that's available to you through various government institutions and even private institutions. There are a lot of large leading developers that do require that you have a surety program in place. They may never request a bond, but it gives them confidence that your company is stable and established, that you can continue to do work with them. So there are some pros and cons directly associated with having a surety program on your program, because now you have somebody also watching in on you and saying, hey, what are you guys really doing on a profitability level? I like how you mentioned, Andrew, that there needs to be some progressive thinking about what the Surety Association what the surety program really does. It shouldn't be a demand document, but in the last 20 years, it seems like it's becoming more of a demand document. And there could be better guidance and advice provided to contractors to know what are your rights within the bond. Because it seems like when the bonding company does get involved, they're not looking at your rights, they're looking at their own back pocket. So there needs to be better collaboration about knowing what it means. I'm sure Jeff can comment on this, but we're finding more and more projects are getting into claim situation and litigation. And the minute a claim is dropped on the table by a contractor, the first recourse by most clients is, well, we're going to claim on the bond because you're delayed on the schedule, without recognizing that they probably delayed the schedule. So, I'd like to see better language as far as, the surety bond is issued. It's issued for not only just a value of a contract, but a schedule. And if the schedule is changed, then there should be mechanisms that now start to define how that document really talks to the schedule of the job, because the schedule in some ways is dictated by the contractor at the start of the job, but during the course of construction, it's dictated by the design team and the owner. So when they start introducing changes and they start introducing, oh, wait a minute, an RFI got issued. Well, an RFI can only get issued if there's something missing in the contract documents. If the documents were clean and tight, there's no RFIs required. So how does that now influence the impact of the surety document? Because quite honestly, the surety company, they come in and they investigate without understanding why these questions were coming up, who created the questions. And the reality is the questions are a result of usually design or existing site conditions. So I'd like to see that the surety documents start to address those issues as the development happens, because then you'll get a unilateral protection, not just for the government who bought the bond through the contractor who could afford to have a program but bought a bond from a surety company, and then the surety company comes along and says, we hired a lawyer, we hired this guy, we hired a claims consultant. Oh, by the way, you got to pay for all these bills.
Jeff, what's your take?
Yeah, I think that's all bang on. And I think the other thing that Andrew mentioned, which is also just important to remind everyone, is that under the new Construction Act now, there are mandatory bonds for all public contracts for performance bond and a labor and material payment bond. And the threshold for that is pretty low, as long as it's a contract with a government entity, municipality, province, or a broader public sector entity, which really kind of broadens the ambit. Then you do have to have these mandatory performance bond and labor and material payment bonds in place. And it applies to any contract that's over 500,000. So even if you're not in the space where you're traditionally, taking out bonds or required to provide bonds, going forward, it's going to be mandatory on those projects at least too. So, and those bond forms are actually very unique. They're a little different from your standard CCDC form of bond. So it's good to get to know them. And the point about the sureties coming in and investigating and understanding that process, these new form of bonds under the Construction Act they have a lot of detail in there about that, and they're a little different. So getting on the same page with your surety, reviewing those, making sure you understand how they work, I think is really important going forward too, because they are going to be very commonplace now.
Okay. And speaking of things that are new, what are some new offerings that companies have, brokers and sureties, and what that enhance offerings to contractors? What's sort of the new hotness, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Yeah, there's been a lot of change, Warren, in the past couple of years, whether it's been the pandemic and some of the health and safety changes, whether it's been the move towards e-bonding, whether it's been prompt payment legislation, as Jeff had mentioned, or new bond forms. And like Zulq said, like bond forms are coming up. There's GCs that are creating their own forms. There's the Ontario government that's got their own forms. SAC just very recently released a new enhanced performance bond. So there's a lot of different forms out there. So from the standpoint of a broker, you've got to be providing more than just a bond, right? If you're a broker that's just issuing paper, you're really not providing any value add, right? And so when your contractors as a broker get into situations, whether it's a dispute or a delay claim or something else, you need to be able to be an advisor and an advocate for them and give them a sense of how to navigate that situation, whether it's with the surety or otherwise. And you've got to be able to do other things. You've got to be able to connect them with the right advisors, whether it's the right project management software, the right construction lawyer, the right construction accountant. And you've got to be advocating for them, right? You've got to be out there and active in the industry, whether it's with the Surety Association Canada, getting involved in sort of negotiating bond forms and ensuring that sort of the contractor's best interests and the surety's best interests are sort of kept at heart. Those are all critical. And then from the surety standpoint, there's a lot of new stuff happening too. They're building their own digital bond distribution platforms to provide a service to contractors. They're looking at adding additional claims resources and construction expertise to better help their clients and brokers. And they're also working with SAC on some of the new enhanced bond forms. And so the one that came out last week, Jeff had talked about a couple of the changes, but they're there to provide more clarity in the claims process, both for the contractor that's provided the bond and for the owner or the GC that's accepted it. And so some of those things include like a pre-default meeting where the parties can get together and you can look to avoid a formal default and termination on a contract. There's timelines for the surety to acknowledge certain things, and then there's an ability for the contractor to do some mitigation work while the surety's completing their investigation, among other things. And so those enhancements are all supposed to take sort of what was the primary bond form in the CCDC format, and just provide clarity for all parties on what that process looks like and avoid the worst case scenario.
Okay. And my next question is about delay claims, which are can be one of the biggest challenges for contractors. And what could contractors be doing better to protect themselves? I'm pretty sure Zulk's got a thing or two to say about this as an ex-contractor.
Yeah, being an ex-contractor is fun, and moving over to the technology realm to support contractors has been an interesting journey as well. Delay claims are becoming a byproduct of work now. It's really, the delay claim should be called a comedy of errors. Why did it really happen? And the comedy of errors really starts at the very beginning. There's little investigation done on who the client is, and more importantly, after the client's issued their project out for tender, the tendering process itself should be an indicator of how it's going to go. So experience has told me over 20 years that you have a job with multiple addendas, you're going to have a claim, period. Contractors seem to think that there's opportunities with changes, but more and more people are getting a little bit tighter with their wallets, and changes are not opportunities, changes are battles. And that's probably where, Jeff and his team get to come in on the equation, depending on who they represent. That's where the battles start. There's a change on a job, somebody has to pay for it, somebody wants to get paid, somebody wants to make more money because they went in at cost. And the consequence of delay claims start for that. So why are delay claims happening? It's documentation by the client, documentation by the consultant, documentation by the contractor. So for contractors, document your job, know your rights, protect your rights. I'm not saying take a adversarial approach to it, but take a stern approach to it at the very beginning. Don't walk into a job and say, "Hey, we're all buddy buddies," because trust me, there's going to be an opportunity where everyone's going to run to the contract and say, "This is what the contract says." The last session we were part of, Andrew, with your team, is I still object to the whole concept that the design consultant is also the guy who is administering the documents during the course of construction. I think that's a huge conflict of interest. We'll love to see that changed. So if you know that there's a conflict of interest from the guy who's arbitrating his own documents and he's worried about protecting his E&O, then you should be worried about protecting yourself. So how do you do things better for yourself? Simple. Document the job properly. Make sure your documentation is professional. Make sure your documentation is organized and thorough. And more importantly, you have a way to tag it, flag it, and keep a track of it all. So, having Outlook is not a solution. Everyone's got their emails in Outlook. They throw them in a folder, they throw them in 2 folders, they throw them in 3 folders. And then later on, when trouble hits the fan, everyone's scrambling to start printing everything that's in Outlook. Well, problem number 1 is the subject doesn't make sense. The string is so long that you can't even follow the string in the format. So, when you send out an email, end the conversation with that initial email. If you have to continue a conversation, start a new thread and adjust your subject line. It will keep a proper way for you to document your paperwork if you're going to be using Outlook, right? If you're relying on Word and Excel, you are living in the 70s. You should step forward. Okay.
And just for the audience, Zulk's doing a lot of sort of air quotes. So anytime you hear an intonation, that's an air quote. Just so that makes sense.
Word and Excel are not smart technology tools. They were in the 80s and the 90s, but in 2020 and 2021, they are no longer smart tools. They're to the point where they've got so many bad rules available that you could exercise that they've given you bad habits. We had a debate yesterday about, what's the big deal about ending an email? And I said, no way ever should one email have multiple people in the to subject. If you ever wrote a formal letter, and Jeff can confirm this, the letter was addressed to an individual, and you might have copied them and putting their name at the bottom of the letter. But there's no one letter that gets issued to multiple people, right? They're addressed individually. And everyone can go check their emails and see how many people are in the to line. And they'll go, whoa, wait a minute. So who's responsible for that? Those are little things that will create problems for you for sure down the road on bigger projects.
Jeff, this sounds like
and organize your paper.
This sounds like something you'd need to weigh in on. or at least a lawyer's take would be good to have.
Yeah, no, for sure. And, I couldn't agree more with Zulk's emphasis on keeping records properly. I mean, that's a huge issue from a legal perspective when it comes to actually being able to prove, that a delay occurred and how it actually impacted the performance of your work. And we see that a lot of the times in court cases and arbitration cases where, there probably was an actual delay, as the contractor was alleging, but you just didn't have the proper records to be able to substantiate it. And then the other thing I'll just note is, and again, Zulk mentioned this as well, is just notices, right? Nowadays, construction contracts are so, robust and sophisticated, especially on the requirements to provide notices. And, certainly as a construction lawyer, I see a lot of delay claims get compromised and unfortunately thrown out sometimes because the notice requirement wasn't complied with. Right. And it's often very short, like 10 days or 10 working days after a notice, after a delay has occurred, that you have to provide that notice. And, you want to make sure, as Zulk said, you want to make sure you provide it to all the appropriate details are complied with in the contract, right? Who's it going to? Can you actually deliver it by email, or does it have to go by courier or fax? We still see that in some old contracts. So opening your contract up and actually seeing what the notice requirements are and making sure those are complied with, that can save you a world of hurt down the road for sure.
Okay, and my next question is about legal stuff too. So Jeff, just, hold on. The prompt payment, you've said there's changes, and obviously there's been changes. Are there more adjudications or less? Do you find people are litigating issues after project completion? How is this prompt payment? How have these changes changed what you do?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I would say from my vantage point, it seems like the uptake on prompt payment and adjudication in the industry has actually been relatively slow, even though it's law, right? These rules are mandatory. It's not like you can contract out of them. But, I personally have not got a lot of calls from clients about prompt payment, questions like, what notice do I submit? Or I didn't get paid on this date. What am I supposed to do with my subcontractors? So the uptake has been fairly slow in the industry, and it's not entirely clear what the reason for this is. I suspect, I suspect it's a few things. First, obviously, prompt payment and adjudication were grandfathered into the province of Ontario. So the transition rules in the Construction Act state that, effectively it only applies if the contract between the owner and the contractor was procured after October 1st, 2019. So we still actually have a lot of projects out there that are not in prompt payment yet, because the RFP was issued in September of 2019. But still, with that said, I think you'd still expect to see more activity around prompt payment and adjudication with the newer contracts. So another reason I think is simply the fact that prompt payment rules in the adjudication process are very new, right? And I think it's just going to take people time to adapt and learn what their rights are under the statute, right? We're moving from this old situation where it was the owner dictating the payment terms in their contract and the general contractor dictating the payment terms in their subcontracts to a situation now where the payment terms are dictated by statute. And I think that kind of shift is just going to take some time for people to adjust to. And then just in terms of adjudication, to my knowledge, there actually haven't been that many adjudications, certainly not as many as you'd expect to see. And I think, again, it just goes back to it's going to take people some time to appreciate that this new dispute resolution process is available, right? And I think once that really sinks in with the industry, and maybe that takes another year or another 2 years, but once that sinks in, I think you're going to see contractors and subcontractors especially coming to appreciate the utility of something like adjudication and how much quicker you can resolve disputes than litigation and arbitration, and letting a dispute just kind of sit there and fester and grow until the end of the project, right? Adjudication provides a much quicker way to deal with it head on right at the beginning. So it has been a very slow uptake, but I think eventually we're going to see the industry take it by full force for sure.
Okay, and Andrew and Zulk, I remember you guys had some opinions about this in our first show, so maybe you could do a little quick summing up of what your take is.
Yeah, I think, Jeff, you kind of hit the nail on the head a little bit. It's been a slow uptake. COVID obviously has caused a lot of slowness in the overall adoption of things. I think there's underlyingly still the fear that what would happen if I presented or demanded my payment. I don't think that fear is going to go away just because they enacted a law. The people who are suspect payers are going to continue to be suspect payers because they'll find a way to wiggle around it. But I think the most important message you can send out to anyone is just know your rights, and don't be shy to enforce your rights. I'm not personally a big fan of the prompt payment legislation because, quite honestly, the people that weren't paying will continue not to pay. There's a lot of clients that are sitting in the government entity role that really have no excuse other than themselves and their bureaucrats for delaying your payment. I would like to see further advancements that once there's a certificate of payment issued, that the money is electronically wired into your account. Like, it should just automatically flow. There shouldn't be, oh, well, hold on, it's got to go to my accounting department, et cetera, et cetera. That's from the owner to the contractor. And I think that electronic payment really needs to be introduced in the whole spectrum so that it will speed up the, oh, well, I got to get somebody to sign this check for you. Those really silly excuses that will still hamper the guys who are getting paid down the chain, that will start to speed up the process. So I think until you put a few more electronic mechanisms in place, Jeff, I think the intent is right behind prompt payment, is that they've recognized that there's a problem in the sector. People need to get paid. But how you're going to enforce it, I don't think the adjudication is the process. I think, hey, you don't get paid, walk off the job site, have a good day.
Yeah, and I agree, Warren, with both Zulk and Jeff. Like, at the end of the day, a contractor working on a job, I mean, it's a relationship there between them and the GC or the owner, right? And so because there haven't been that many adjudications and it's been a slow uptake from our standpoint as well, like, it's sort of, do you want to be the first guy to present an owner or a key client that you're working on multiple projects with an adjudication in the middle of a job, right? And does that jeopardize that relationship or whatever else? But I think from our standpoint, like, and when a surety or broker looks at this and there's a dispute on payment in a job, that can impact your bonding facility if you're not getting paid. And ultimately, a lot of people have done that in history with lien rights. Like, they just wait and they wait and they wait, and they hope that because it's a good client, it'll eventually get there, and they pass their lien periods or whatever else, and they forgo critical rights that puts their business in a tough position. And so I think contractors need to realize that this is legislated, it is required, and that adjudication is an option to address a non-payment issue. And it's not personal, it's business, and everybody getting paid on a project is going to ensure that project gets done on time, and everybody in the pyramid on that job makes money, because that's the goal, right? The owner gets a great project, and everybody in the pyramid makes some money.
You know, I wish contractors would take a little bit of the lawyer mentality into their mindset. I don't know too many lawyers that won't work without retainers. I don't know too many lawyers that will go too far past their retainer before they ask for money, before they'll issue the next document. So if contractors would follow the advice of their own lawyers and follow what their lawyers do, then they probably would put themselves in a better situation. Because, Jeff, I can imagine your firm doesn't go too far out before you say, hey, I think I need to top up my retainer again.
Yeah.
And then you just stop working. You'll just say, hey, I'm just actively removing myself from the file, go find another lawyer. So I think there's the growth here.
And I agree. I think if contractors can, I think they now actually have they have more teeth behind just digging their heels in and saying, like, we're not working. And that's the beauty. One of the beauties about adjudication is that once you get that determination, it gives you an actual statutory right to demobilize and just walk off the site if you don't get paid. So that's, that's great, because a lot of the construction contracts out there actually typically don't provide you with that right. I mean, there often is a right to suspend work or terminate the contract. But there's, it's often a much more lengthy kind of default process where you have to send a notice, and the notice is often disputed, and then the surety gets involved, as Andrew would know. And, now you kind of have this, regardless of what your contract says, you have this statutory dispute process that would give you a right to stop working if the owner refuses to pay an adjudicator's determination. And the only other thing I'll just add quickly is that, the UK has adjudication, and they've had it for quite some time. And we've definitely seen, just going back to Warren, your original question about how will this impact, litigation and arbitration that we traditionally see at the end of jobs. Certainly what we've seen in the UK is that the number of litigation cases, so the number of court cases in dealing with construction issues, dropped drastically after adjudication really got implemented, because it was used, and people resolved those disputes in that quick manner, and you didn't have these big claims at the end of the job. So a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel if we can look to kind of that as a precedent, and that may be where we're headed, which I think would be a good thing.
One thing I would say fundamentally is different between the United States, the UK and North America, is the design caliber is significantly greater when you get to Europe. And a lot of the problems they have are stemming from other issues because they're dealing with older cities and they're building in complex environments, so they get paid for it. But if you go across the world, even into the United States, the trivial issues that we have with the design documents, they start to stop to exist, especially around Ontario. You leave Ontario, they get better. So, it's encouraging to know that the UK was successful at it, but there's also the caveat that there's an element that the design consultants need to come in, and I'd like to see adjudication address the design problems that we're having with the documents that are being generated in Ontario, because it is a gong show.
Okay, and so my final question is that what will be your advice be for contractors dealing with project management? You've already given some of this, so and ensuring paperwork, documentation, follow-ups completed, like you said, stop printing emails. But what would all three of you say would be good advice in that regard?
Well, I will say I'm biased. Obviously, we have a construction management software that we're marketing. If you're not using an integrated kind of platform or a construction management tool at this stage, you should step forward. There are value-added solutions that are out there that, for the cost of a couple of rounds of golf per month, you can have a solution in your hand, and trust me, it's better than the round of golf you're about to spend. So be organized, have dashboards, be on top of things that are going to derail your project. Things that derail your project is not managing your changes, not managing your RFIs, right? The guys in the field will pour the concrete in the box, I assure you of that. Mm-hmm. But what they won't do is they won't pour the concrete in the box if they're waiting for an answer. Right? So document it, buy the technology, invest in technology. It is your new tool. I can assure you that nobody in construction, or very few people in construction, knew about Zoom in 2020. In 2019, absolutely, it was like a fragment of a percent. So if they've adhered to Zoom or Teams, this is a great opportunity to take the next step forward and get into a technology platform.
Andrew, go for it.
And many of those systems are much more value than a round of golf, especially if you play with me. So I usually shoot over 100, pretty. But no, I can't agree. And can't agree more from the surety's perspective too. Like as you're growing your business and you're looking for more capacity and you're trying to protect yourself from risks on projects, building that sophistication into your systems, and like Zulqa said multiple times, like if you're operating through Excel and Word and whatever else to track your projects, it's not going to work for you. And what the sureties look at a lot, especially when you start getting into larger jobs and longer term jobs and more complex scopes of work, is how are you tracking your costs? Do you know where a project's at from day to day? And you can see an issue and you can see a slippage in margin on that job, and you can address that. And if you don't have a good system to do that, it's not going to inspire confidence, and at the end of the day, most importantly, it's not going to protect your business from issues, because construction's a tough industry, and every contractor's had to deal with a problem project, and having the right system in place is just going to make those instances happen less.
And Jeff, I mean, I know as a lawyer, when people don't document things, it's probably to your advantage. But please, A, correct me if I'm wrong on that, and B, give your point of view.
Well, I would qualify that by just saying it's actually a nightmare as a lawyer when you don't have good documentation, because then you're really behind the ball. And so I couldn't agree more with those comments, is that when a client comes to you and says, well, we have a dispute over a change order, unforeseen conditions, delays, whatever it is, the clients who are more organized, I have to tell you, higher chance that they're actually going to win. And it makes the lawyer, you feel it's a huge sigh of relief when they say, here are all our documents properly organized. We kept track. Here are the records. We kept updated schedules, the documentation that makes, a lawyer's life trying to advance and prove a claim or a dispute in, court or arbitration much easier. So, I would agree with all that for sure.
Okay. I'd like to thank all three of you for all your appearances on these podcasts. And if you'd like to listen to this or any of the other podcasts in the Surety series, you can listen on Amazon Music, Apple Music, Spotify, or on the Daily Commercial News or Journal of Commerce websites. Thanks for listening, everybody.
This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Greater Toronto Sewer and Water Main Contractors Association. Clean water, our goal, our future.